As I was reflecting on the explosion, the cultural explosion that happened in the 60s, I think one of the things that also struck me was how significant that time was. Not because that's when all of the changes that we're talking about began, but something exploded at that time. And I've reflected on the fact that that particular generation, the 60s generation, not only reshaped the 60s in terms of what it meant to be a teenager, but since then they've reshaped every generation they've lived in. Whether it's what does it mean to be in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, and now even into your 70s. What does it mean to be an individual living in the West at that time? And I guess that I'm aware that the church has always been struggling to keep up with that. How do you respond to this cultural explosion? And as you described earlier, Al, the response of the church has often been in the UK to look to America, where the church seemed to be successful, for programs, programs to fix. And even in the midst of all of that, even in the search, I was aware that this problem wasn't fixable like that. There's something going on that just can't be fixed with a program. So there needs to be this complete reimagining of who we are. And that's an immense challenge.
It's an immense challenge. I think the 60s in North America took somewhat of a different turn than your description in the UK and Europe, in the sense that it's really important to remember the 60s was an explosive time. But in Europe, it was an explosive time that still lived in the devastation of the wars.
That's right.
Whereas in North America, it was a time of great celebration that in many ways the wars never touched, and massive economic development. And so a whole generation is born called the baby boomers, who have shaped us intensely, and our churches, and you and I are those. And in the 60s, there was this belief in our generation that the age of Aquarius had dawned, that something new had happened, and there was a sloughing off of tradition, and we could make a new world. And there was tremendous energy in that in the 60s. But in North America, by the time you get to the end of the 60s, all that had gone. And it gets expressed best in two movies, Easy Rider and Alice's Restaurant. And in both of those movies, at the message in the midst of those movies was this great outburst, and forgive the language, what the hell happened? And when you move into the 70s, you move into an end of that sense that we can change the world, and a movement of the boomer generation into what you call identity. Who am I? How do I develop myself? Which all gets picked up in kind of the new psychology and transpersonal stuff, and goes into the church in small group movements and how we feel about each other, and spirituality and self-development. And so, and the suburbanization of the church shaped that. So that what you've had is a whole generation that, in which the 60s, fundamentally, its openness to a huge change got shifted into identity. And the suburbs became the primary place for experiencing that identity. And the consumer capitalism began to shape it. And that's the strangeness of it all, is that the 60s, with its emphasis upon the individual and the self and great freedom, created the suburbs and a captivity to consumer capitalism. And I would argue that, again, most of our churches and most of our denominations, who are designed really around a certain kind of business model, have never ever come to terms with that. And that's why they're still deeply anxious about how they fix themselves.
Yeah, I think it is, as you say, a little different in Europe, but still that theme of celebration in the 60s was there, that there's a new hope. To some extent, a lot of Europeans look to America as, even then, as the secular place of hope, that anything was possible. Coming from America, and the era of the Mad Men and all of that sense of there's a whole new world out here waiting to be discovered, tinged with disappointment at the end of the 60s, which is probably summed up best in the 68 nearly revolution in France, where the whole thing in a sense came crashing down in that moment, and still makes a huge impression on French culture. They even have a term for 68, those who lived then.
Correct.
Yeah, the soixante-huitards,
Yes.
which is curious, but it just echoes this sense that something went wrong. But we don't quite know what it was, but let's forget about that, because we know we need to make money. We need to discover ourselves. We need to explore what it means to be freed of any obligation, any commitment to any kind of form of structure, institution, authority. And that's been obviously very difficult for the church to kind of figure out.
Yeah.